On September 26, 1792, the British delegation under the command of Lord George Macartney would depart from Portsmouth and set sail for China. Although the East India Company had already made contact with China, trading at Canton for over 100 years since 1684, this would be the British Empire's first official envoy to make contact with China. The British would be hopeful in establishing a permanent embassy in Peking, now Beijing, while also relaxing trade restrictions, offering penetration into the lucrative and untapped Chinese market. However, upon arrival at Macau, it would be made clear this would be no easy game of diplomacy. The Qing court would organise encounters between emperors and other lords under the rubric of bin lai or guest ritual. It would be seen as improper for a tributary mission to select its own port of arrival, thereby requesting the British to land at Guangzhou, some 1,000 miles from the intended destination of Peking. In dismay, the British would allude to the precious nature of their gifts, insisting the ardent terrain would be infeasible to prevent these gifts from being damaged on the long journey. In consideration of this, coupled with the fact that the great distance these men had travelled, the Shanglong Emperor would finally agree to their request. And so, on the 23rd of June 1793, the British would leave Macau. Meanwhile, as they departed, the Chinese would express surprise at the speed and size of the visitors' ships, who would, surprisingly, sail the high seas then hop from port to port in the shallow waters as was the Chinese way. Finally, the delegation would land at Peking on the 21st of August. Their gifts, intended for the Emperor, would be stored in the throne room at the Old Summer Palace. 70 members of the mission, including 40 soldiers, would leave Peking on the 2nd of September, heading north towards Jihol, where the Changlong Emperor awaited them. While traversing a river on their way, Chinese flags would proudly declare, "The ambassador bearing tribute from the Kingdom of England." The British, hoping to keep positive relations, would simply ignore this issue. You see, for the Chinese, these lesser lords or Fan Wang had chosen to come pay their respects to the Huangdi or Supreme Lord. After all, the lesser official is not invited, but simply requests permission to enter the imperial domain. However, the British would see themselves as the most powerful nation on earth, taking that at minimum they were equals to this kingdom, but certainly not tributaries. Alas, they would refuse to perform the kowtow before the Emperor and his messengers, taking it as humiliating and slavish. So, upon arrival of an imperial edict sent by the Emperor himself, they would simply leave the room, avoiding humiliation and disrespect. Since such a practice could not be performed in the presence of the Emperor himself, a compromise would be struck. Macartney would greet the Emperor the same way he would his own sovereign, bending down on one knee. On his 58th year of his reign, the Changlong Emperor would receive Lord George Macartney, Ambassador of Great Britain. The Chinese would set up a tent in the garden of 10,000 trees, a mountain retreat for avoiding the summer heat. For Macartney, he would aim to show respect but also impress the Emperor, wearing an embroidered velvet coat displaying the Order of the Bath, a diamond badge, and on his head sat an enormous white plumed hat. The British would set off from their residence early in the morning, arriving at the Imperial encampment an hour later. Before them, the British would be greeted with a large yurt. Inside, one would see tapestries, curtains, carpets, lanterns, and tassels disposed of with harmony. Macartney would observe that the colours would be so artfully varied, and the light shade so judiciously managed, the room would fill the eye with delight. Approaching a platform placed in the centre of the room, kneeling on one knee, Macartney would exchange gifts with the Emperor Changlong. After receiving his guests, the Emperor would signal for the British to sit on his left, the most prestigious position. Breakfast would soon be served, with the Emperor himself presenting a goblet of warm Chinese wine. Despite their hopes, the Chinese only recognised vassal relationships in international relations. For them, there is a world society under China's cultural and religious ceremonial leadership. Such a tributary system would also be expanded to cover trade. If a nation wanted to avoid this, they could simply refrain from sending embassies in the first place. This notion was strictly Confucian, a relationship between superiors and inferiors. In this way, the sending of embassies with presents merely indicated that they had recognised the natural order of things, hereby offering tribute and recognising Chinese dominance. So, although Macartney hoped to preserve the honour and sovereignty of his country, he did not prevent his country from being seen as a tribute-bearing nation. After their meeting, the Chinese would ultimately reject the British aims. When presented with a series of gifts ranging from scientific instruments, examples of British arts and crafts and manufactured items, the Chinese would signal their preference to draw up designs of their own. Allegedly, once the emperor was presented with these gifts, he would declare, "These things are good enough to amuse children," hereby signalling his disinterest in the British claims. In a letter directed to King George III, the emperor would state, "All European nations, including your own country's barbarian merchants, have carried on their trade with our celestial empire at Canton. Such has been the procedure for many years, although our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. There was, therefore, no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce." Later, the emperor would note that, "Should your vessels touch the shore, your merchants will assuredly never be permitted to land or reside there, but will be subject to instant expulsion. In that event, your barbarian merchants will have had a long journey for nothing. Do not say that you are not warned in due time." In closing his letter to the British king, the emperor would declare, "Trembling obey and show no negligence, a special mandate."